Well, we'll go ahead and we'll get started. For folks online, we're about a minute behind. That probably doesn't matter as much to them as it would to us, but I'm excited about tonight. Am I particularly loud this evening? I'm going to go adjust the volume just really quick. So. All right, that's a little bit more of a conversational level. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll try getting started again. Yeah, more of a conversational tone than a booming off of the mountain tone. I really enjoyed, for those online and for those in the room, we were talking about the Expositor Seminar. And of course, we were fortunate to hear John Mark on Sunday and get to visit with him for a while. But then the last couple of days, we've been out at Camp Yamhill, Don and I and a few others. It was just very refreshing, a lot of really good, insightful thought and teaching. I made a joke. John Germain and I were talking about the difficulty in getting John Mark to sell his book, because Don had brought it up to him. You know, your book is really good. If you wanted, we could share it with the congregation and let them know about it a little bit, and they could, potentially go read it. And that's all right. That's all right. And then in the afternoon session, Don pulled it out and he said, really good book, you may want to consider buying it. And his words were something along the lines of, or you could just, go back and listen to what we recorded. And I told John, I don't know that I've ever seen an author so resistant to selling his own book, which is actually kind of refreshing. So, yeah, it's a really well-written book. And what I appreciate about it is that it conveys well his humility about any position he's going to take, that he recognizes there are people that could disagree with me and they'd have arguments about that, and that would be okay, and I really appreciated it. Tonight, we are in Genesis. Surprise, surprise. We're continuing through the story of the sons of Isaac now, and the end of the life of Isaac in many ways. We'll actually tie a bow on his life here shortly, but tonight we're looking at the final chapter of his life, more or less. I want to start by reminding us of something from Genesis chapter 25. This is verse 27 through 28. And it says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. I've heard a lot of different sermons preached on this particular couple verses, and a lot of times it seems as though they want to maybe even underplay the wording that's used here, this idea of loved. And so I did a little bit of a word study on this myself, especially going into this evening and thinking about the story as it's told and the interplay between Rebekah and Isaac. Maybe to salvage the very strong language that's used here, that Isaac loves Esau and Rebekah loves Jacob, as though maybe they don't have much affection for the other child. And I thought maybe by looking at the Hebrew, I would find a way to, weasel into that particular position. The wording that's used here is actually, it's really strong wording. It's not just had a greater affection for, but it is an intense love. It is a deep, abiding affection for an individual. And that they've chosen to use this word in relation to the parent and the child is really to suggest that there is such a deep connection that it overshadows the relationship between the other son and the other parent. That, in this case, the kind of love that Isaac has for Esau does greatly overshadow the love that he has for Jacob. And also Rebekah, her love for Jacob overshadows her love for Esau. Not just our personalities mesh better, or a season of feeling a greater affection for a child. We all have those moments where we've got a 13-year-old and we've got a 9-year-old, and the 9-year-old is just a little bit more lovable than the 13-year-old. And neither of my children are in the room to hear me say that. But then, shortly we'll have a middle schooler and a high schooler, and maybe that'll change, right? The truth is, we go through seasons where we maybe feel a strongness or a connection with one child more than the other, and that shifts and goes. The suggestion here is that this is an abiding reality for both of these individuals, that through their lives, Rebekah was always closer to Jacob, that there was a connection between the two of them that was never felt with Esau, and the same for Isaac and Esau. And I want to suggest tonight, as we read through chapter 27, that I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, especially as we read the story and we take into consideration the things that have been said leading up to this particular story. I won't go into it much more than that because I actually want us to read all of chapter 27 together. And so I'm going to look for a volunteer who is willing to be our reader and stands already on it with the microphone back there.
One comment.
Yes.
Esau wasn't Sarah's son.
Not Sarah's son. You're right. Rebekah's son. Did I say Sarah a couple times? I may still be stuck in the story of Abraham and Sarah. And so, but yes, Rebekah and Esau, Rebekah and Jacob. So, do I have a reader for chapter 27? Stan?
No, go ahead. Read the whole chapter.
Yeah, the whole chapter, all the way through.
Can I be heard on this?
Oh, absolutely.
Now it came about when Isaac was old and his eyes were too dim to see, that he called his older son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he said to him, "Here I am." And Isaac said, "Behold now, I am old and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, please take your gear, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die." And Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game to bring home, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Behold, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, saying, 'Bring me some game and prepare a savory dish for me, and I may eat and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, listen to me as I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me 2 choice kids from there, that I may prepare them as a savory dish for your father, such as he loves. Then you shall bring it to your father, and he may eat, so that he may bless you before his death.' And Jacob answered his mother Rebekah, 'Behold, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, then I shall be as a deceiver in his sight, and I shall bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing.' But his mother said to him, 'Your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go. Get them for me.' So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother made savory food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her elder son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on a smooth part of his neck. She also gave the savory food and the bread which she had made to her son Jacob. Then he came to his father and said, My father? He said, Here I am. Who are you, my son? And Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Get up, please, sit and eat of my game that you may bless me. And Isaac said to his son, How is it that you have so quickly, how is it that you have it so quickly, my son? And he said, Because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me. Then Isaac said to Jacob, Please come close, that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Jacob came close to Isaac his father, and he felt him and said, The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. And he said, Are you really my son Esau? And he said, I am. So he said, Bring it to me, and I will eat of my son's game, that I may bless you. And he brought it to him, and he ate. He also brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, Please come close and kiss me, my son. So he came close and kissed him. And when he smelled the smell of his garments, he blessed him, and he said, See, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Now may God give you of the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and the abundance of grain and new wine. May people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. Now it came about as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had hardly gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. Then he also made savory food and brought it to his father, and he said to his father, Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. And Isaac his father said to him, Who are you? And he said, I am your son, your firstborn Esau. Then Isaac trembled violently and said, Who was he then that hunted game and brought it to me, so that I ate of all of it before you came, and blessed him? Yes, he shall be blessed. When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. And he said, Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. Then he said, Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me those 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. And he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me? But Isaac answered and said to Esau, Behold, I have made him your master, and all his relatives I have given to him as servants. And with grain and new wine I have sustained him. Now as for you, then, what can I do, my son? And Esau said to his father, Do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. So Esau lifted his voice and wept. Then then Isaac his father answered and said to him, Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven from above. And by your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck. So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. Now when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, Behold, your brother Esau consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice and arise, flee to Haran, to my brother Laban, and stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides, and he forgets what you did to him. Then I shall send and get you from there. Why should I be bereaved of you both in one day? And Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth, like these from the daughters of the land, what good will be my life be to me?
So reading through this chapter, there are a lot of things that I think probably stand out and are worth our comment, and we're just going to start right at the top here. When Isaac was old, and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, My son. Here I am, he answered. There are a handful of things in this first verse here that I think are worth our note. And one of them is going to come to play a little bit later on, possibly next week or the week after. The description of Isaac's eyes as weak. It's something that we're going to see play out in the life of Jacob, the weak eyes. That's, that it happens here. It is a part of the story, but I think there's also something thematic about it. A thing that maybe we're supposed to understand moving forward is there's a connection between the individuals that we see with weak eyes, and we'll talk more about that later, but I just want to draw it to mind before we arrive at the second occurrence of this phrase. The other thing is that Isaac calls for Esau, right? And this should not be too big a surprise to us. He is the firstborn son. We've already been told that Isaac loved Esau, that this is his favored child, the one that he has greater affection for. And so here, at the end of his life, as he's old, as he's frail, as he's struggling, this is the son that he's called for comfort to himself. And Esau knows, this is my role. This is what I'm going to do. It's what I'm here for. But we as the readers know something that neither of them seem to at this point. I want you to think back to chapter 25, and I want you to think about this moment. Rebekah, pregnant, heavy with child, as the Bible would say, is experiencing turmoil inside of her body over these two children. And God offers Rebekah a special revelation, essentially. She receives a word from God. The last woman to have received a word from God was Hagar, right? Now, God has spoken to Sarah, I believe, through Abraham, but in this case, God is speaking to Rebekah directly and offering her some insight. She's concerned about the children, and God says that there are two nations within her, that they are quarreling with one another, that the younger will rule over the elder, right? These are God's statements about what's going on. And I think from that moment on, Rebekah recognizes that it will be the second child that God is going to offer the promise to. That God's plan moving forward is for the younger of these two children to be the one that inherits the promise. And we're not told that Isaac receives this information. This is not something that the Bible goes out of the way to say. Now, the Bible tells us that God makes a revelation to Isaac, that he does in fact tell him that he will carry on the promise that was given to Abraham, and he reaffirms all of the promises he made to Abraham to Isaac, but he doesn't give him the insight into which of these children will be the one to carry the promise forward. And I don't know if I'd ever noticed that until this most recent read through. This is in some ways, maybe Isaac doesn't know he's not supposed to give the blessing to Esau. Now, if they're a good husband and wife, maybe they've communicated this multiple times before, and Rebekah's been like, hey, Isaac, this is what God told me is going to happen. But in this particular case, maybe they're not. We do see a little bit of dysfunction here. They're not a perfect couple by any stretch of the imagination. But Rebekah, I think, is listening to the voice of God. I think she recognizes that what Isaac wants to do may not necessarily be in line with God's plan, in line with God's will, as much as as he loves Esau, as much as this is the child that he has a deep, abiding affection for. This is not the one that God has chosen. Lavera.
That helps my looking at the scripture a little better, the idea that she knew and was carrying through with it.
Right.
Because otherwise my thinking is
And that's how I read it so
deceptive,
often.
but yeah.
Yeah, and I think partly, and we're doing it this way on our Wednesday night class, because we oftentimes are pulling out an individual story and examining it, we sometimes forget the narrative continuity here, right? All we have to do is go back 2 chapters, and we see a couple of things established almost right away about these individuals. The scripture has given us the special insight that Esau is the kind of man that we don't follow his story. That's just the way that Genesis has worked up to this point. He's a little bit more of a strong-headed man. He's a little bit more of honestly, he's a go-getter, we're going to see. He's a guy who's going to found things and do things, and he's going to kind of gather acclaim for himself to some extent. He's a mighty hunter like Nimrod. These are things that, for whatever reason, the author of Genesis wants to highlight as, and that's why we don't follow his story. That's why his line is not the chosen line. In fact, we might read about Jacob and we kind of get the sense, well, he's a quiet man who lives in the tent, and he, doesn't go out and hunt. He's not a big, brash individual. And in fact, what we end up seeing is that he's maybe a little bit more like the Abraham that we're introduced to at the beginning of Abraham's life, who doesn't necessarily seem to be an entrepreneurial spirit, right? He's reached a point in his life where he's content to dwell in his father's household, and it's not until God calls him to do something with him that anything seems to have happened in his life. And that could be Jacob's story in a lot of ways. Left to his own devices, Jacob might never do anything particularly great. And we're, in fact, going to see that there are some character struggles within Jacob, some rough edges that need chipping away at, right? But we're given that insight early into these 2 individuals, that Jacob is in many ways not the kind of person we would choose to be the main character moving forward. And I think Isaac gets the sense that Esau is. Surely, this mighty hunter of a son, he's the one that God is going to use to found his kingdom and give me many, many offspring. But Rebekah's been given other information. And Rebekah sees in her son the son that God has promised. And so I think that that's maybe one of the things that in this particular read-through of Genesis has really stood out to me. As Lavera said, a lot of times we read this chapter independently of the other chapters around it, and we look at it and we say, oh man, she's deceiving her husband. She's lying, and she's coaxing her son into being deceptive. Now, let's be fair. Her son is a deceptive individual. He's going to prove to be a bit of a trickster over the course of the next several chapters. And sometimes the being a trickster thing is not so bad, and other times it's it results in him receiving a little bit of tricksterdom played on himself. I think that he gets a taste of his own medicine, which is probably a good thing. But overall, when we see that Isaac calls Esau to the tent, we should have that moment where we say, hold on, this is not the way it's supposed to go. And as we read the next words that are said, he said, behold, I am old, I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Right? Now you kind of hear in this father's words the enthusiasm for his son's prowess, right? Take your weapons, your bow, your quiver. Go into the field and be the mighty hunter I know you to be, essentially. You can get the understanding why Isaac would look at this young man and say, this is the one who's going to be the child of promise. And when we get to the end of those words and he says, that I may bless you, we as readers from the previous chapters should say, that's not what God said. And then maybe we should ask, have Isaac and Rebekah not been talking about what God is going to do in these two sons? And if they had, would they have spent a lot of time telling Isaac, or telling Jacob and Esau, you are both deeply loved, but God has a plan for Jacob. God has a direction for him to go, and you will both be blessed. But the blessing from God is for Jacob. Maybe that conversation would have happened. Maybe it never happened. And here, there is an urgent moment for correction because things are about to go in a direction that God has said it's not supposed to go. And so out of desperation, maybe out of favoritism, possibly both, Rebekah acts. And what we end up seeing, of course, is the story that we play out, especially in our children's classes. I remember as a little kid, my Sunday school teacher brought in the sheepskin that you put on your hands. And I remember thinking, I've never met a man who is so hairy that this would be believable as his arm, which tells us maybe something about Esau. Like this guy had to be pretty rugged, right? I had a friend in college. His name was Dustin Merritt, and we were in the same service club at Cascade. We were both Tri-Phis, and Dustin was probably the hairiest fellow that I'd ever met. And he had, if he took his shirt off, you thought he was wearing a sweater. And I'm telling you this story. This is a digression. This is a rabbit hole, or a rabbit trail that we're chasing here. His fiance at the time, Heidi, was telling us that when she was a little girl, her dad was very hairy. He had hairy arms, and his face was, very thick, full beard. And she remembered as a child praying, God, I want to have a hairy husband just like my daddy, and prayed it over and over and over again. And she hadn't told him that she'd prayed for this like her entire life as a child, because she was worried that if she told him that he'd be like, you're the reason, Anyway, now I have a context for how hairy Esau had to be, because Dustin Merritt was probably as hairy as Esau. All of that to say, we see the deception play out, right? They go to great lengths, and Jacob is not 100% on board. He says, if I go in, he's going to know it's not Esau, and I'm going to be cursed instead of blessed. And Rebekah takes the full burden on herself and says, if that's the case, the curse be on me, right? That's her concern about making sure that this child that God had said will rule over his brother receives the blessing that he's supposed to receive. And of course, we've had events up to this point that have made it clear, no matter what, Jacob's coming out ahead in the end because Esau is impetuous, right? We have the story about the stew. As I want to remind us here, once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in, this is chapter 25, came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore, his name is called Edom, because he ate red stew. But we already know that he was also a red and hairy baby. So multiple reasons for him to be called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." And Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went to his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So we have this word birthright, and I thought it would be good for us to examine the difference between a birthright and a blessing, and what the difference happens to be there, because I know really until about 2 weeks ago, I had no idea what the real difference between these two were. Like I had an inkling to it, but I didn't fully understand, and I hadn't ever heard anyone teach on what the difference is. So I want to talk about birthright for just a moment. The Hebrew word for birthright is bechorah, and I'm pronouncing it completely wrong, but bechorah. It's got that sound on the K. A birthright would be best understood as the individual that would become the head of the household. The firstborn son had a birthright to become the head of the household, a right to his father's estate, and a right to a double portion of inheritance. So if there were 5 sons, the inheritance would be divided in 6 parts, and the firstborn son would receive 2 of those 6 parts. If there are 2 sons, it would be divided into 3 parts, and he'd receive 2 of those 3 parts, a double portion. So it would not leave the younger sons destitute or in a extreme position of being unable to support their own family, but it would definitely be an advantage for the eldest son. But it also came with a lot of responsibility. Again, this idea of being the head of the household, of having a right to the father's estate. It's not just a right to, hey, I get to do with it whatever I want, but you are now responsible for all of the members of your father's household upon his passing. Part of the reason you receive a double portion is that you have a greater responsibility than your brother. So interestingly, when Jacob steals Esau's birthright, or Esau foolishly gives it up, he's actually taking on himself a greater amount of responsibility. And as I was reading this, the thing I started thinking about is the framing that we've been given of these 2 men at the very beginning. You see, if Esau is going out and hunting, and he's, a man of the field, literally the same phrase as man of the soil, which is what it's applied to Noah right after the flood. A man maybe planting a vineyard, so he's hunting and he's making himself, alcoholic drinks or something out in the field, the wine press. We're already told he's not necessarily a man who's thinking of domestic responsibility. But Esau, the quiet man at the tents, wherever the tents go, that's where the sheep are. Wherever the tents go, that's where the servants are staying. Wherever the tents go, that's where the women are. Wherever the tents go, that's where the father comes back to in the evening to ensure that everyone among the tents is receiving the things they need to receive, the care and attention that is required. And I always thought that what we were being told when we read about Jacob being a quiet man who dwelt in tents, I thought that we were being told, maybe he was just a little weak, not a man's man. That was sort of the framing that I read it in. And as I was reading through a lot of different commentaries, one of the things that they pointed out was that this is a man who is observing the function of the household, who knows the people. This is a man who is preparing for the possibility of taking on the responsibility. And while Esau is out having great adventures and carrying his weapons, notice that Isaac was like, take your weapons with you. Maybe he's expecting him to come back and tell stories about, the fight he got into with another guy over a boar that he'd shot or something. Well, not a boar because they're Hebrews and no eating boar. Over the game that he had found out in the field. That's not the kind of man that Jacob is. He's a quiet man. Watching, observing what's going on in the tents, watching the people, caring for them, seeing how things are administrated. And this is maybe when Esau comes back, Jacob is thinking, there's no way this man is ever going to be prepared to run this household. Look how impetuous he is. No forethought for his own well-being even. How is he going to care for the household? Now, he's a trickster. Let me be clear. I'm not trying to redeem all of his actions here. But there is a part of him, I think, that sees his brother and says, this is not the kind of man I want to take over my father's household. This is my chance to ensure my family moving forward successfully. Give me your birthright. I want the responsibility. Yes, there's a double portion involved there, but what I want is the responsibility of the management of the household. I'll ensure our future. Again, trickster, deceptive. Maybe he could have asked his brother, hey, wouldn't it be great if you could just go out and have your wild, crazy adventures all the time, and I'll take care of the household? That might have been the better way to go about it. There wouldn't have been all the animosity that comes later on. But I do think that there is some redeemable quality to what Jacob expects for himself in the care of his family moving forward. Now, blessing, this is another word entirely. It's echoes of a covenant, right? This is when you listen to the words that Isaac speaks to his son, the covenant language is sort of there. This idea that God is going to have a special blessing for you, that the land will be good for you, that the rain from heaven will be good for you. There is kind of a religious expectation here. In some way, it's like the father acting as the priest, passing on the mantle to the next generation, where the first is sort of an administrative set of duties. The second are religious expectations, that your relationship with God will be blessed so that the entire household will be blessed, right? And up to this point, we don't even know that Isaac would know that Esau has sold his birthright. That's something that comes out towards the end of this chapter, where Esau suddenly exclaims, he got me again, right? This is his response to finding out that the blessing has been stolen. And you start to wonder, okay, yeah, how did you think it was going to go without the birthright to receive the blessing? And how are you going to ensure the religious and spiritual health of this family if you've given up what you needed to provide for them? The blessing and the birthright are two different realms that a father might entrust to his child. And a blessing, while expected for the first son, doesn't have to go to the first son. It's not a requirement. Neither one of them are a requirement, but there's certainly a cultural expectation that the birthright's going to the first son. And in fact, we'll even see in Jacob's life a moment where he gives the blessing and the birthright to children who are not the firstborn. So keep that in mind as we get later on in Genesis. But that's maybe an echo of his father's mistaken offering of the birthright and the blessing. So all of that to say, let's look at the actual blessings that are given here. Don.
One other thing that may flick back to there, talking about the backstory a little bit, and maybe you're going there, but in chapter 26, the last verse,
Mm-hmm.
where it says, at the age of 40, Esau married a young woman named Judith,
Yeah.
the son of Beri the Hittite. He also married Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah.
Yep.
So, there might have been something there, too, that Esau, not only did he
Mm-hmm.
the birthright didn't mean much to him.
Yep.
And like you said, he was out hunting and may have been less responsible. But he also, clearly, they weren't supposed to marry the Hittite women. They
Yeah.
were part of the covenant.
Yeah.
And he had two of them.
Yep.
And they weren't, you don't say, well, they were like rude, sweet ladies that, were willing to.
Yeah, we don't have an example of the Moabite woman who becomes the righteous woman later on. This is
He's made life miserable.
absolutely.
He says, for both Isaac and for Rebecca.
Yeah, yeah.
So all of a sudden you say, okay, we're going to give the blessing and the household and everything.
To a man who has married in such a way that he would already be violating the covenant,
He's
right?
gone most of the time, so these two wives are going to
Yeah,
have the power.
absolutely.
And that are they're Hittites that
Yeah.
may not be following Yahweh at all.
Which draws us back to the end of Abraham's life and the beginning of the Isaac narrative, right? Where one of the things we had drawn out about Rebekah herself is that she's an extremely hospitable woman, right? That she receives the servant of Abraham and goes above and beyond, a literal answer to prayer in this man's life. And we should see this as a contrast, absolutely. So where she is a joy, not even to her family member, right, but to a stranger. She doesn't even know yet that this is a servant from her family member's household. She just wells up with hospitality for him. And you contrast that with these Hittite women.
And to follow up that too, that would mean that Jacob was 40 as well,
Yep.
and he was unmarried.
Yeah.
Which say, well, there could be lots of reasons he was unmarried, but real possibility is the only women around were Hittites. He
Yeah.
hadn't been back up to Padan.
Yeah, he's living down here in Gerar still, right? At the tree that's been planted by Abraham, grazing these fields with the sheep. There are no women around here I want to marry. That's what he's thinking, right? Because he's seen it play out in other people's lives. He knows what the people down in the valley are like. He's heard the stories. Uncle Lot. He can think very carefully about the family history and where they're at. Ben. Which pun? Oh, I didn't even think. Oh, no. I mean, yes, that was completely intentional. I am that clever. Yeah. I appreciate you giving me the credit to potentially be that clever. So, well, I think that's a really good point, though, Don. And at the end of this chapter, I think that is reaffirmed too. It's no coincidence. Thinking again in the chiastic structure of Genesis, where you have the kind of repetition of themes to kind of draw us back to, oh yeah, I've seen this before. Within Isaac's story, which is really the story of his two sons, the end of this chapter and the end of the previous chapters highlight the distasteful nature of Esau's wives, right? So we'll get to that here in a moment. But that's a really wonderful thought to remind us. Not only has Esau never shown the administrative qualities that would be required of a head of household, a patriarch, literally a patriarch, he's chosen women that, not to stereotype, but in this case, the thought process is Hittite women were not the kind of people to manage this kind of household. And you think about it. They're women of the city, right? In the book of Genesis, people from the cities are not a number one grade people. They're the kind of people that have to have their entire civilization wiped out because of their wickedness, and they don't know what it means to go out and be the wife of a shepherd, to administrate the tents and care for the servants. These are not the kind of women that are cut out for the sort of life that the man who will inherit Isaac's household would need to have. So that's a really thoughtful comment there, Don. Thank you. Much appreciated. All right, now, the blessing. The strangest sentence in all of the book of Genesis. See, the smell of my son is the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. It's just, to my ears anyway, it's a very strange sentence, right? The smell of, it smells like a field. Okay, that's great. And of course, what he's smelling is sheepskin, which makes you wonder, what did Esau smell like? We get a really vivid image. And it's affectionate language, right? Like this is my son. This earthy smell about him, and it is a tender moment, I think, and it's unfortunate that Esau doesn't get this moment himself. And had things gone differently, maybe Rebekah and Isaac communicate better, or maybe Isaac remembers the conversation he had with his wife about what was going to happen with these two boys. Whatever the case may be, perhaps he could have delivered a very similar blessing without undermining what it was that God intended for Jacob if circumstances were different, right? The smell of my son, the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. You hear some of that covenant language, especially there at the end. God tells Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse, right? And Isaac carries that blessing on to the son of promise. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. You have this very vivid imagery of, I want you to have success where you plant, where you harvest. I want you to have the people around you essentially fall down before you out of reverence, really. And it's not just, I'm offering you what I have. It's, may God give you these things. If you remember, we talked about how in a lot of ways, Isaac's story is Abraham's story, but more. It's bigger. Where Abraham digs a well, Isaac digs many wells, right? Where Abraham has to learn a hard lesson through, lying to a king twice, Isaac does it the first time around, and he copes fesses up to the whole scheme the first time around. He doesn't make the mistake twice. I think Isaac's expectation for Jacob, for the son of promise, is that God is going to do for you what he's done for me. Where I've succeeded, you will exceed more greatly, not because of what I'm handing off to you now, but because of what God is going to do in you. And of course, we get a second blessing in this chapter. And I want to talk about that second blessing that ends up coming along, because Esau comes in, he discovers the plot has come to pass, and he is heartbroken over the situation, furious, enraged, and he wants so desperately to be blessed by his father. And the blessing maybe comes off initially as though it's a little hollow. And I think there's some translation issues here. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I want you to listen to the words. They're very similar blessings. Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Now that end portion there is very different. But the language of the first, in some ways, is an inversion of the language, or the language of the second is an inversion of the language in the first, right? Where you've been promised the dew of heaven and the fat of the land. Here you're being told that it will be, your dwelling will be away from those things, that you won't experience these great things, which doesn't sound like much of a blessing. It sounds like, well, you're going to get what life hands to you. There is something to be said that over the course of the remainder of the book of the Old Testament, or books of the Old Testament, we will see every little bit of this come to pass for the Edomites. They will become vassals to Israel under the rule of David, and a few generations down the line from there, they'll serve faithfully under Solomon, but a few generations down the line, under the wicked kings, they actually do rebel. The Edomites, I don't know if it's a righteous rebellion, if you would call it that, where they say we're not going to work for wicked kings, but they rebel. They cast off the yoke of the Israelites, and they leave. They cease being involved in the duties that they've taken on as vassals of Israel. So So that's, an important thing. What I want to bring up, though, is something we've encountered a couple of times in Genesis so far, and that is the problem of prepositions. And so I want to share this with you. We read, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth." And before we talk about this particular translation issue, I want to think back to God's statement to Eve: "Your desire will be contrary to your husband, and he shall rule over you." Or, in other translations, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Okay? In Hebrew, oftentimes, when we read about something having a direction in which it's moving, there are multiple ways that we could think about it. So contrary to and for are two very different prepositions, right? Like against and for. In Hebrew, though, those two terms are the same thing, that something can be against a thing and for a thing. It's directed that way. That's literally what it means. Your desire will be directed against your husband, right? Your desire will push into him or toward him. And here what we're seeing is something very similar. This away from could also be understood to be translated as of. So out of or coming from. This directional language here, away from, in the Hebrew, can also mean of, the thing that is coming from that thing. So, behold, of the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be. All right? And of the dew of heaven on high. Now, here's where this works out, because we know that the land of Edom is not a lush land, right? It's not the kind of land you would want to take for yourself. Like if you had the first choice, you would not choose Edom. In fact, it's just not, scripturally, it's not a place that you want to go and live if you have the opportunity to dwell on the other side of the sea, right? This of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven on high, combined with by your sword you shall live, tells us that all of Edom's descendants are going to take from the people that are receiving these things. Okay? So right now, the people that are dwelling in Canaan, the fat of the land with the dew on the ground, they're harvesting, they're slaughtering their cattle, they're taking the fat in for themselves. You know, this is a good, healthy, hefty sort of place. You know what the Edomites are going to do? They're going to go and they're going to get their living by taking it by force from the Canaanites. In other words, the Edomites are kind of the pirates of the valley. This is their role. And in many ways, they're continually and constantly undermining the growth of the Canaanites. Now, Don and I talked about this a little bit. For quite a while around this era, Egypt slowly yet surely expands into what would eventually be Israel. The northern part of the kingdom really pushes up into modern-day Palestine. And on the other end, the Babylonians are building downward into the same area. And there comes a point, actually around this time, that small pockets of Canaanites, the Philistines actually being people probably from like Macedonia, across the sea a little ways, maybe up in Greece and even Rome, they come and they settle on the coastal area. And you have these competing groups that kind of keep the Egyptians and the Babylonians from ever really pressing in and taking a firm hold of the region. And so for a period of time, there's sort of a contested space there and a little bit of like a no man's land in the middle, the zone where nobody ever really settles except the Canaanites. And the whole time that the Canaanites are in this fat, lush area, you have the Edomites who are building up their kingdom over here, and they constantly go in and they take from the Canaanites. They do like these shock troop maneuvers into the land, and they take the fat of the land for themselves and live comfortably in the highlands that nobody really wants to go and live in as kind of like, again, pirates, thieves. And God uses them as a tool so that, and this is often said by scholars, when the Israelites arrive at Canaan, the Canaanites have done a good job of really pushing Egypt and Babylon out of Palestine. But they spread themselves so thin because they're constantly being invaded by the relatives of the Israelites who live across the river, that they just never really are able to fill the cities that the Egyptians and the Babylonians have left behind. And so you get to Jericho, and you see these mighty walls that have been built by a kingdom that has now receded into the south, and it's filled with a bunch of people who don't really have the resources to maintain it themselves, and it's really impressive on the outside, and maybe there's some giants living there, but it's a skeleton of what it was before, because God has continually used these relatives of the Israelites across the river to undermine the development of the people in the land. And so you read the story of Joshua and you see the Israelites come in, and it's like, well, how are they going to do this with a few hundred men? Well, first of all, because God's on their side, but also because God's been on their side from the very beginning, and through the events of history, he has weakened the military forces. He has spread thin the Canaanites. Now, that means that there's a lot more places that the Canaanites need to be driven out of. There are a lot more places that they've settled. There are a lot more lands and towns that are kind of bare bones, fewest number of people to keep a town running sort of situation. But God has really placed it completely open for them. He's used a man like Edom, Esau, and his descendants to make it a cakewalk if the Israelites will just walk in. So when we read this, what we're seeing is that God is saying, look, you're not going to have a lot for yourself, but you're going to be able to take an awful lot for yourself. This is in many ways Isaac promising, look, you're going to be a pirate your entire life, but you're going to eat really well. You're not going to have to worry about whether or not it rains on your side of the mountain, because those Canaanites are going to grow your crops down there. And this, to me, ends up becoming maybe the wish fulfillment for Esau, the mighty hunter, the man of the field. You mean I get to go in and have a raiding party? This is ideal for me. This is Esau's best possible outcome in his life. And in the moment, it's small consolation, right? He hears his father's words and he thinks, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but where is what I deserve? I'm the firstborn. Where's what I deserve? But even in this, a good father makes provision for his son. And a good father makes provision for his sons. Yeah, that's the thing that really stands out to him. You will serve your brother. And it's like, oh, I don't want to serve that jerk, right? He's a thief and a coward, and he couldn't go out and kill a deer if he wanted to, right? This is an infuriating moment for him. But I think as readers of the book, the thing that we begin to see is that even in this, there is provision. And of course, Moses, or the writer of Genesis, can look back in history and say, well, isn't it convenient that the Edomites are cousins? We're right there. Isn't it convenient that the sons of our father Abraham all settled along the eastern bank, and that the sons, inbred cousins that came from Lot, all took up residence along the eastern bank? Ben.
When you look at that when you're 20, about having to serve your brother, it makes sense. As you get older, like you're saying, there's a lot worse cases,
Yeah.
They're not enslaved to Babylon, or they're not enslaved to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Esau comes back, not
Yeah.
too much, but it seems like there's a better, it
Yeah.
having to take care of your family and serve your family.
There's this long gap in which Esau has the opportunity to really reflect on the gift his father's given him, right? Hey, there are a lot of nations you could serve under. At least in this case, it's your brother and not the Canaanites, not the Egyptians down south, not the Babylonians up north. You're going to be part of the family still. And it's similar to the promise that Noah makes to his sons about the situation that will happen. You're going to dwell in their household, and you will serve your brothers, right? This is not completely unfamiliar language, but I think even in this, there is more provision for Esau than there are in those other situations. And we end up seeing it. And Esau, I think, given the time, like you said, when you're younger, although 40 years old in this case, but for this particular era in history, 40 is still like the old 20, I guess. He has time and perspective when Jacob comes back. And he is a wildly different man in that case. I look forward to getting to those chapters because they say a lot, I think, about how time changes us. Dawn.
The thing that kind of hits me too with this, in our context today, if this kind of thing happened,
Mm-hmm.
they would contest the will.
Yeah.
They'd say, well, Isaac was too old, and he wasn't in a sound
Yeah.
mind.
He couldn't even tell that was sheepskin,
He
It's,
wasn't in a sound mind when he did this. I mean, he was mistaken. He
yeah.
deceived. Or else, the whole thing was predicated on fraud.
Yeah.
And both, there would have been a way around it.
Absolutely.
And it kind of strikes me in this that I wonder if Isaac realized, now this is God's will.
Yeah.
That I was trying to pull a fast one so that the older one would get the blessing.
Yeah.
But I did know all along that God meant for
Mm-hmm.
Jacob to get it, even though I didn't want it.
Yeah.
Because it came off this way. And I don't know, it's just, it makes me think in modern day, what a mess this is. How this would be contested in court.
Yeah, absolutely.
The lawyers, these would go crazy.
Yeah. I agree. So for those online, Don was saying, if this were a thing happening today, it would be contested in court. The last will and testament is a big deal, and you would contest it based on senility or the inability for him to perceive what was really going on. It may be that, and Don had pointed this out, that he knew that this was all supposed to go to Jacob based on conversations with Rebekah. It may be that he didn't. But in either case, if he did know, this may be God's way of subverting Isaac's subversion, right? That God is going to say, no, you might be able to pull a fast one on your wife. You might be able to pull a fast one on your son. You can't pull a fast one on me, right? Who knows? Maybe, so she overhears the conversation. Did God maybe say, hey, Rebekah, go stand over by that tent for a little? Who knows? But the key here is that what God has said is going to happen, happens. Rebekah is a tool in that. Isaac is a tool in that. Even Jacob and Esau are tools in carrying out the will of God. So absolutely. I think there's this chapter in so many ways is deceptively simple, but also deeply complex. So let's go ahead and wrap up. We're 5 minutes over. I have one last thought here. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? And that's where we hear this echo that the daughters or the wives of Esau made life unbearable for Isaac and Rebekah. And we'll pick up there next week. Thank you, guys.